The audience who are already listening to our discussion, they must have some idea about. Let me take this opportunity to introduce Professor Dr. Cardwell, who is a professor in the Department of Agribusiness at the University of Manitoba. Professor Ryan is president of the Canadian Council of the International Association, and he is a member of the editorial board of the Canadian Journal. Professor Ryan's research interests include the economics of policy, international trade regulation, and foreign aid. With a focus on international food aid, current research topics include understanding of support for economic policies, the effects of tariff barriers on international food, and the effects of regulation. And today, Professor Ryan will be talking about the political economy of subsidies, and the topic is how baked in are preferences for economic evidence from a customized survey experiment. Over to you, Professor Ryan. Welcome, and thank you very much for sparing your precious time for and researchers of university, the researchers from different universities of the.
Great. Well, I really appreciate the invitation. Thanks very much. I know I've corresponded with at least a few of you in the past through the PSSP program. It's nice to put at least one face to the names I've been reading. And it's great to be able to present this. So I had gone back and forth a little bit about which topic might be best to present. We discussed maybe a food aid topic, but we decided on this one. And so I will start sharing my screen here and confirm that everything is showing up for you guys all right. So maybe can I just get a thumbs up or something? Can you see my title slide? Does it look all right?
Yes. Go ahead. Okay. We can see.
Great. So what I'm going to talk about today is actually a work in progress. Actually, I have another meeting this afternoon in which my co-author and I are going to discuss some other things we're trying. And so my co-author is Chad Lawley. He's a resource economist in my department here in Winnipeg. And what I'm going to talk about today is a paper we've been working on for a while now, and the title, How Baked In Are Preferences for Economic Policies. So what we are trying to understand in this paper is, first of all, how individuals' preferences for government policies related to food and agriculture are formed, and how flexible those preferences are. So are they, we use this phrase baked in here to describe something that is very deep-seated, a strongly held preference that is not responsive to, as I'll describe, changes in or some new information about a policy. And it has stemmed from this research idea. I'll get through it, but it stems from some research that my co-author Chad and I have been working on for a number of years, and it's led us down this path. So with that, I will get started. And I'm not sure what your tradition is, if you typically hold questions till the end or clarifications in the middle, but I'm flexible. So.
Normally, we take questions at the end of the presentation, but if you feel like to make it an interactive session, we can do it.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do either. So I'll just keep on going, and if there's something, if you want to watch the chat or the questions, and if there's something you think is worth interrupting, I'm happy to do that as well. So, but I'll try and leave time at the end. So. So I'll just get started. So first, the policy that we are going to be discussing specifically today is something called supply management in Canada. And it's a very well-known controversial policy here in Canada. And it is applied to the farm-level production of milk, chicken, turkey, and eggs in Canada. So the production of all of these products on every farm in Canada is regulated through this set of SM or supply management policies. And there's three main components to this set of policies. One is a set of production quotas. So in order to sell farm level production of eggs or milk or turkey or chicken, the producer, the farmer, has to hold a license, like a fixed number of eggs, for example, or liters of milk that they can sell to a provincial marketing authority. And that's the only way you can really sell these products in Canada, is through this regulated path. And so there's a fixed quantity. So the regulating authority caps production of these products across the country. Okay, so it's almost like a cartelized production system. Okay, so that's the first important component. The second one is the way that farmers are paid for these products. So they are paid not sort of a market rate that we would teach our undergraduate econ students. They're paid through what's called a cost of production formula. So these provincial marketing authorities conduct surveys with producers across the province each year on the cost of inputs. And then they calculate a price to pay these producers based on that cost of production. Okay, so it's a regulated price that everybody receives. Okay, and then the third component, pardon me, that really holds these other two components together is a set of very stringent import controls. Because of course, we border the United States, where production of these products is very high and prices are low. So in order to keep those relatively low-priced products out of Canada, there's a very strict set of tariff rate quotas that regulate imports of these products into Canada. So the tariff rate quotas, these are two-tier tariff rates. So there's a very low tariff rate on a small quantity of inputs. And then once that import quota is filled, which is very small, like 3 to 5% of domestic consumption, the tariff rate goes very high, prohibitively high. So, the market for these products in Canada is very closed. We don't export hardly any of these products, and we import very little. So it's a domestically controlled, cartelized production and trade system. Okay, so this is the policy that we are applying our research question to. And it's an interesting policy in the context of Canadian agriculture. It's been around in its current form for almost 50 years. And relative to other Canadian agricultural subsidy policies, it's unusual in that it's old-fashioned. So there used to be a lot of these kinds of policies in, in Canada and in the United States and the European Union and places like Japan, that targeted specific products and had sort of price controls and a lot of import controls. Canada has really moved away from those types of policies for most other products, wheat and soybeans and canola, to less distorting policies. So it's sort of an old-fashioned policy that we don't really use for any other product anymore. It's also interesting because every political party, and I'll talk about these in a few minutes, supports this supply management policy. It's a very contested political issue between voters and columnists and journalists and academics. But the members of Parliament in Ottawa, with the marching orders from their party leaders, all voice public support for this policy, which is interesting because it's an unusual policy in the context of the rest of our agricultural support policies. So this is the policy, background of the policy that we're going to discuss. I'm going to spend not so much time talking about the specifics of this policy, more about how we're trying to understand individual preferences for this policy. So I've been working on issues related to supply management for a number of years. And in 2015, my co-author Chad Lawley and I, we wrote a paper that looked at the distributional effects on consumers of this regulated production and distribution system. And I'm not going to go into that paper in any detail, but one of the important outcomes of supply management is that consumer prices for milk and turkey and eggs and chicken are higher than they would be without the policy, right? It's a regulated production system that pushes price up. Pardon me. So what we were interested in is what is the distributional effect of these higher food prices on consumers. Of course, so what we were basically trying to do is quantify the effects of the Engel curve of this policy. So low-income consumers, of course, spend a higher share of their incomes on food. So higher prices affect them more substantially than high-income consumers. And so we tried to put some numbers to that. We estimated a fairly sophisticated demand system for all of these products and applied counterfactual prices and pulled out some welfare measures. And so, this diagram here kind of shows the punchline of our research, is that the implicit tax of these higher prices is much higher on low-income consumers. So low-income consumers in the bottom quintile face an implicit tax of about 2.5% of income as a result of these higher prices. high-income consumers face an implicit tax of about 0.5%. Okay, so it's what we would call a regressive policy, right? It imposes a relatively larger burden on poor consumers than rich consumers. Okay, so we published this paper in 2015, and it got a lot of attention. So the producer groups were very unhappy with it. Some of my colleagues were skeptical of it, and so this paper became a bit of a lightning rod in our careers, and we had spent a lot of time dealing with inquiries and blowback and controversy about this paper. So that then led us to try and understand more deeply what causes and what influences people's opinions on economic policies more broadly. So we started getting into this literature about support for farm subsidies on the one hand, and more broadly government policies in general. So what is important to voters in the determination of their support for public policies? So there's a big literature on this if anyone is interested. The two streams we were looking at, there's a small literature in the United States looking at voters' preferences for farm subsidies. Right, so farmers in the U.S. generally are relatively high income, but still very heavily subsidized. And so there's some literature that has looked at, do people support this? Do they support their tax dollars being used to subsidize farmers who are already relatively high income? So there's a literature on that. And then the other literature we really got into was a literature that more broadly tries to understand people's deep-seated preferences for government policies, like redistributional taxes, and estate taxes and carbon taxes and things like that. So what are the important things that determine whether voters support government policies related to subsidies and taxes and trade barriers as well? So there's a big literature on this, and we learned a lot from reading some of these papers that do a really good job with these big data sets, and this really helped us decide on how we build our survey and analyze our data. So, our research objective is to try and understand Canadian voters' preferences for, in this case, supply management, but more broadly speaking, what determines their support for these policies and how flexible are these preferences? If we tell them something specific about this policy, good, bad, or otherwise, does it change their opinion? Something maybe they didn't know or that contradicts what they had believed before. And supply management, SM, I'll use this acronym probably throughout, that's just supply management. It's really suited to this kind of study because it's a very interesting, complicated policy. It operates in several domains that we're interested in. It redistributes income from consumers to producers, and it's redistributive as well from, or within consumers, more burdensome on low-income consumers. And people typically have strong preferences on redistribution. And the other thing about it is it's very complicated. People, I spend a lot of time in my teaching. It's a great teaching tool because it has all these interesting economic elements that lay people don't understand. Right? It has production quotas, and we can draw graphs for that, supply and demand graphs. It has trade barriers, and not just tariffs, but TRQs. So it has all these very non-transparent, difficult to understand elements that, so people, if you ask even an up-to-date, well-educated person who follows the news, they don't really understand what's going on with this policy. And it's very prominent. It's in the news in Canada all the time. When there's an election or a new trade negotiation being debated, supply management is always in the paper. So it's an interesting policy to analyze. So what we try and do in this paper is we try to understand how do people feel about supply management, broadly speaking, just in a survey. And then what we are interested in more specifically is how sensitive are those preferences to new information about the policy. Okay, so I'll describe these information treatments we give them, but what we're interested in is that if we tell them something about this policy that they may or may not approve of, does it change their opinion? Okay, or how baked in is the phrase we use. My co-author came up with this phrase baked in, which I really like. It's, I can tell you anything about a policy and it doesn't change your opinion about it. If so, your preferences for that policy are very baked in. They're not responsive. Okay, and then we look at some heterogeneity. We get an average treatment effect and...
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, your voice was muted, I think. Okay now.
It's okay? Okay. Yeah. I'll, if it happens again, let me know and I'll take a pause and start again. And then we're interested in investigating whether that effect is heterogeneous between, voters of different parties or people in different provinces, things like that. Okay. So the way we do this is with a survey, which I'll describe, and then we have a referendum question on this policy. And then we randomize people within this survey to receive different information treatments, and then we investigate heterogeneity, and I'll describe how we've approached that so far. So just a preview of results, which I'll show you in some detail. Support for this policy is quite heterogeneous. So we find, average support is quite high, but it differs between, for example, voters of certain political parties. It differs based on perceptions of farm income, things like that. So support is high, but it differs across people. But we also find that the preferences are quite what we describe as baked in. So the treatment effects of receiving information on the policy don't really move people very much. And again, there's some heterogeneity in that. Some people are more responsive than others. But broadly speaking, support is quite high, and the treatment effects are quite small. Okay, which was interesting, especially in some of the heterogeneous investigations that I'll describe. So let me now get into what we've actually done in the paper. I guess actually before that, are there any general questions about what we're trying to do here before I get into the weeds of how we've approached this?
Do we have any questions? Dr. Fasal, if you are.
If not, I'll just keep going, and then if someone wants to...
Yeah, no problem. Yes.
Sure. So the data that we've used in this study comes from a survey that we conducted, and we hired a private survey polling company in Canada. It's called Ecos, and they maintain a panel of individuals who have agreed to participate in surveys. And I won't go into the recruitment strategy, but they try and make it a fairly representative sample across province. And of course, in Canada, we have 2 official languages, so we conduct this in English and in French. So we collected this survey data, and after we've collected the data, we do a sample weighting of our observations to make it even more representative of the Canadian population. So this is where our initial data come from. It was an online survey, which was very important for our purposes, as I'll describe in a few minutes. But we customized the survey to every person in a way that I'll describe. So it had to be online so this could happen. There were some calculations happening in the background. So they would be answering this on their mobile device or on their computer. By social science standards, it's a very large sample. We had 5,400 people conduct our survey. So we have a big data set. We can do lots of interesting things with this. And we conducted, there were actually 2 rounds of our survey, but it was mostly sort of at the very end of 2018 and then 2019. So here's what people saw on their screen, something like this. They would click radio buttons on their computer or their mobile device, answering the question, and then click next. So this is just a screenshot of an example of what they would see. So there were a lot of questions in the survey. It was fairly long by the standards of this kind of project. I think the average respondent would take maybe 15 to 20 minutes to complete the survey. So we first had a set of food policy questions. So this is before we even tell them it's about supply management. So at this point, we would ask them, what are your opinions on things like taxes on sugar sweetened beverages, so fat taxes? How do you feel about country of origin labeling requirements, or bans or restrictions on genetically modified organisms in food? So we would ask questions like that. Then we would ask questions broadly about opinions on government policies related to things like redistribution. Do you think the marginal tax rate on high-income people should be higher so that it can be lower on low-income people, for example? So we're trying to get an understanding how they feel about redistribution, broadly speaking. Okay, and then some demographics, where do you live? How much income do you make? What's your education level? Things like that. Then we ask a set of questions in which we want respondents to tell us what they think relative incomes look like. So do they think that farmers are relatively high income or relatively low income? It turns out, as I'll show you, farmers are relatively high income in Canada, higher than average. And then we want to know where they place themselves in the income distribution. Okay, and then we give them some information. Okay, you've answered all these questions, great. We are going to now ask you some questions about this policy supply management. Okay, so of course, some people will be at least passingly familiar with supply management. Most people have heard of it, but we wanted to give them sort of a baseline set of information about the policy. Okay, and then we ask, we tell them this boilerplate. We say, okay, here's what the policy is, and then we ask them, okay, given what we've told you, what do you think this policy does to food prices? Do you think it increases food prices, decreases them, or doesn't affect them? Okay, which turns out to be an important question in our investigations. Then we do these treatments. So everyone's the same up to group 6 or 0.6, okay? And then we randomize. So we take our 5,400 people, we randomly assign them to one of 4 groups, okay? So the first group is the control group. We control our control in our randomized controlled trial here, and they just get that baseline information of supply management, which looks like this. So I won't leave this up long enough, you don't have to read the whole thing, but basically we wanted everyone to have a baseline set of information about the policy. So we kind of chose these non-controversial sort of stylized facts about the policy, just to tell everyone, this is how it works, right? It's got the production controls, the import restrictions, and the price formulas for farmers, and then 3 basic outcomes. Okay, so everybody got this. Okay, the control group as well as all of our treatment groups. Okay, so that's the baseline. Okay, and then we ask them this: what do you think would happen to prices? Would they go up, down, or otherwise? By how much? And I'll come back to this. We do some investigation on this. Okay, the second group, so our first treatment arm, gets that baseline, so everybody gets the baseline, plus they get a personalized, customized estimate of how much a household like theirs would spend on these products in a year. Okay, so I'm going to spend a few minutes describing how we do this. This is one of the unique features of our project here, is that we've customized the information treatments to every single respondent. So everyone gets a different cost treatment based on their household characteristics. So the way we did that, and we wanted to do that to make these treatments as relevant to the respondent as we could, okay? So as salient as possible. So the way we've done that is we had basic demographic information about the household. So we knew their income, and we knew the household composition, how many people in the household, and what is the makeup. Are there children? Are they retired? What ages, and how many in each age group? So before we did the survey, we estimated a prediction equation using census data and a Statistics Canada data set. So on the left-hand side, we had expenditure, household expenditure on these SM products. On the right-hand side, we had household composition, right? And so we estimated just a basic prediction equation, a linear prediction equation that captured a parameter on an intercept, and then a parameter on which income group you fall into, and then your household composition, right? So we had these estimated parameters that we had estimated beforehand working in the background, so that once we were told by the respondent, okay, I live in a household with 2 adults, 2 children between this age group, and we have an income of $100,000, for example. This is what the respondent told us. Then in real time, in the background of our survey instrument, we plug those into this prediction equation that we had estimated beforehand. So then we come out with this household, this respondent has an estimated or predicted value of spending on supply management products. In this case of, here's our intercept. They've got 2 kids, 2 adults. Here's the parameter for that income bin, about $1,500 in a year on these products. Okay. So this is happening in real time as the respondent is doing the survey, sort of, immediately in the background. It's an easy calculation, but that's happening in the background. Okay, and then we take that $1,500 and we then have a further random element in which we're going to tell this respondent, okay, you spend this much on supply management. If the policy didn't exist, you would save money. okay? And how much that household would save, we randomize as well. So we, there's controversy about how much prices are affected by supply management. We sort of choose a range, okay? It could be as low as 10% price premium. It could be as high as a 50% price premium. And we chose randomly within that and said, okay, for example, this household who spends, or a household like theirs spends about $1,500, they get a treatment that looks like this. Data suggests that a household like yours spends about $1,500 a year on these products. If supply management were removed, prices would be, so randomly assigned 40% lower. You would save about $12 a week without this policy, okay? So the objective here is to give this respondent a customized number for basically how much this policy is costing them every year. Of course, we don't know how much it's costing that person. They could be quite different than our prediction equation, but it gives a fairly good estimate, okay, based on Statistics Canada data. Okay, so this is the second treatment arm. They get something that looks like this. We call that our cost treatment. Okay, the second treatment arm, or the third group, gets that baseline plus a statement about the distributional effects that I described early on in this presentation. So basically, we're trying to distill Engel's law into one short paragraph that people can understand. So we want to convey to them, here's this policy, it's relatively more burdensome on low income than high income people. So they get this statement here. Research suggests that it increases prices. This means it's a larger burden on poor people than rich people. Okay, so that's the second treatment arm, or the third group. And then we have a final group that gets both. Okay, so they get the baseline and they get both treatments. Okay, so those are our four groups out of that sample of people who answered our survey. So it kind of looks like this. We had 5,400 respondents. After we do sample weighting, some of them didn't answer questions we needed to weight, so we're down to about 4,700. And then we assign them randomly to one of these four groups, and these are sort of our samples. The control group, 1,200 get the cost treatment, 1,200 get the distributional effect information treatment, and then another 1,200 get combined. Okay, and these are our four groups that we're analyzing. Okay, so that is our starting point. Then, of all of these 5,000 people, we then ask a referendum question. Given what you now know about supply management and your preferences more broadly, how do you feel about the policy? So we ask a referendum question. So, I won't read all this, but basically we say, if the government were considering removing this, getting rid of the TRQs, etc., here's what would happen. Production controls would disappear. The border controls would disappear. Farmers would be compensated. The producers who hold quota would be compensated. We've done more work on that I won't have time to get into today. Would you keep it or get rid of it? So this becomes the outcome variable of interest for us. Your response to this referendum based on what you know. Okay. And then we ask some more demographic questions. So that's our survey. This is where all of our data come from. Okay. So that's the survey. Any questions on the survey before I start getting into some results?
Yes, anyone interested in having a quick discussion about the survey or the questionnaire? Dr. Rizwan? You
okay,
can unmute yourself.
Oh, sorry, I'll hold for a minute if there's a question.
You can unmute yourself if you have a question. You can unmute yourself, otherwise we'll have all the questions at the end.
Okay, I'll just keep going then, and I'll be sure to leave time.
Sir.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Can you just elaborate the question that you just mentioned here? Actually, I couldn't get it.
So do you mean the referendum question?
No, the equation that you made on household.
Yes. Sorry. This one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll just go through this again because this is actually fairly important to our study. So typically what we're doing here is we're giving the households, or our objective is to tell the households or the respondents who are answering our survey, how much does this policy cost you? Okay. And we wanted that information treatment to be as salient to that person as possible. So instead of just saying, well, on average across Canada, it costs people $400 a year, we wanted to customize that so it was more specific to that respondent's situation. So in the survey, we know they've told us what their household income is and what their household composition is. There are, 2 parents and 2 children between, in my example, 4 and 14. So we can use that information then to get a more precise predicted value for what a household like that would spend on these products. So to do that, before we got into the survey, we had gone and estimated a prediction equation using StatsCan national data, in which we estimated a parameter, an intercept, pardon me, and then a parameter for household income and how much. So the left-hand side here is spending on supply managed goods, dollars. And then the right-hand side is how high is your income and what is your household composition? How many kids do you have? So the data for this prediction equation don't come from our survey. This is from Stats Canada survey data, a big national food expenditure survey. So we did this beforehand and had these estimated parameters, and then we used the data from our survey to plug values, N's and D's, into our prediction equation to customize the information treatment to each respondent. So instead of just saying on average a Canadian spends $400 more than they otherwise would, we say a household like yours with 2 kids and a lot of income, that $100,000 is fairly high income, and you've got 2 kids, so you probably drink a lot of milk and eat a lot of yogurt. So a household like yours spends about $1,500. Somebody else would get a different treatment, right? Perhaps a widowed, retired, single person would get a much lower number. Okay, so that was our objective here, was to customize those treatments to make it as relevant to the individual as we could so that it would really resonate with them. Okay. And then, sorry, one other piece, maybe this part wasn't clear either, is the other thing we've done is we've randomized how much prices would go down as a result of getting rid of supply management. So instead of just saying, well, prices would go down by 20% for everybody, within that treatment, we've randomized, okay, some people will be told prices would go down by 20%. Somebody else would be told, well, prices go down by 50%. And we use that randomization in our results as well. And so then at the end of that, all of that, someone would get a treatment that looks like this. Okay, so I hope that's clarified a little bit.
Yeah, sir. We can move on.
Okay. So I think we were here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to spend some time just looking at and describing some descriptive analysis of our data before I get to estimation results. And this is, we've noticed, when we were studying these papers in a similar thread, these papers are now spending a lot of time doing sort of preliminary descriptive analysis of the data, which was great. It gave us some good directions to follow. So I'm going to spend a lot of time on that. So one of the first set of questions that we asked, pardon me, as I described, were questions about respondents' perceptions on buying habits. And so what this shows us is, for example, we asked a question that said, when you go to the grocery store, do you differentiate between products based on claims like a label that this food is particularly safe for some reason? Okay. So there were people that said they do that, and there were people that said they don't, right? And so we were interested in, among those different groups, are they more or less supportive of the policy? Okay. So for people who said relatively safe food is not important or unimportant, predicted support for supply management, this red triangle here, was about 55%. So 55% of, or I should say, support for the policy in the referendum question was 55% for people who safer food was not reported as particularly important in their purchasing decisions. Okay, the green triangle, these are people that reported to us that they choose food in the grocery store based on some information, probably a label that specifies the safety of this product. So predicted support for that group of people in supply management was much higher, about 70 percentage points. So about a 15 percentage point difference between those two groups of people on average, which is quite large, 15 percentage points. Another really interesting one, we asked people, when you go to the grocery store, do you differentiate, do you actually make purchasing decisions based on whether or not something sells itself as being locally produced? Okay, so again, people who said, local production is relatively unimportant in their purchasing decisions had lower support for supply management, average value of about 54%. People who said this was very important, much higher, about 70%. So not quite, but almost a 20 percentage point difference. So that's really a wide difference in predicted values. Again, do you differentiate based on products claiming to be produced in ways that encourage animal welfare? Similar story. If that's relatively unimportant, you typically have lower support for supply management than people who would report that as being very important. Okay. So this was quite interesting to us. It gave us something to think about in terms of, if you prefer these things, these are the types of policies that may appeal to you. We also asked some questions about specific food policies that the government might impose. So we asked, do you support or would you support a tax on sugary sweetened beverages, like a fat tax? Okay, so people who disagree with a fat tax, would not support it, were less supportive of supply management, about 50% predicted support for the policy. People who were more supportive of that were more supportive of supply management. These are just correlations, by the way, associations. There's nothing causal yet. I'll get to that. We're just sort of describing our data here. Similar story, GMO, country of origin labeling. This one is quite interesting, though, because supply management has very important and restrictive trade barriers. So we asked respondents, are you supportive of policies to reduce trade barriers, broadly speaking, not just on food, but on everything? You sort of support freer trade. So people that strongly agree with freer trade, broadly described, are relatively unsupportive of supply management. So about 45% predicted level of support for the policy. People who disagree, who want more trade barriers, are very supportive of supply management, almost 80% predicted support level. Okay, so some interesting differences here in the types of people that support or don't support supply management, some of which make sense. This one was interesting and was actually a large motivation for our study. So we asked people, do you support a policy that would increase the tax rate for high-income people, right, and then be redistributed to low-income people? So, we're trying to get a feel of, are you in support of progressive redistributional policies on the part of the government? Okay, so here we asked, do you support raising taxes on high-income people? And people who disagreed with that were not supportive of the policy of supply management. And then everyone else is sort of bunched up here at the top. By the way, the markers are point estimates, and the bands here are just our confidence intervals on those point estimates. And here a similar question, do you support increasing social service support payments for low-income households? If you don't, your support for supply management is quite low. If you do, you're very supportive of supply management. Now, this picture is very interesting to us because, what it is telling us is that people who support progressive redistributional policies by the government are supportive of supply management. But supply management is a regressive redistributional policy. So there's sort of this inherent contradiction. And that's what our information treatments try to address. Okay, so what we're sort of observing is that people who support progressive policies, in this case, support this policy, which has regressive distributional effects. Sort of an interesting contradiction. I won't spend much time on this because this is probably more interesting to a Canadian audience who's more familiar with the regional differences on, particularly in this French-speaking province of Quebec. This is also by political parties, so there's a spectrum of sort of left, center, right parties in Canada, and support for the policy varies across them. The blue squares here, these are supporters of what's called the Conservative Party of Canada, which is sort of the relatively right of center party in Canada. Support among voters of that party is quite low, you can see. Even though the party itself supports it, their official line is to support it, voters do not. And then as you move farther to the left, support gets stronger. Okay. If people have specific questions about this, I can always come back, but I've got a lot of these pictures I'd like to get through. So this one is an interesting picture that I'll describe. So on the vertical axis, we've asked the respondent what their income's in, and then we've placed them in bins, right? So as you go up this vertical axis, income of respondent is higher. Okay, and they're grouped into 12 groups, 12 bins. The horizontal axis on this one is we've asked respondent, what do you think average households for Canadians are? Okay, so for example, I'll choose like number 7. So a respondent in income bin 7, sort of the middle income bin of our respondents, we asked that individual, what do you think average household is in Canada? And they reported to us some number, X thousand dollars. And that would have fallen into bin 6, okay? And then we also asked that same respondent, okay, what do you think average farm income is in Canada? Okay, and then they report some number to us. And on average, what they are telling us is, this is the red triangle, they're telling us that they believe that average farm income in Canada is above average household income in Canada, which, by the way, is true. So average farm income and household income in Canada for farmers is higher than average household income for non-farmers in Canada. Okay, which is certainly not the case in a lot of countries, but in places like the United States and Canada and the European Union, it is. Farmers do fairly well. And what we're observing is that at all income levels, people on average think farmers do better than non-farmers, which is true. Okay, which is interesting to us because this is a policy that implicitly subsidizes farm income. Okay, so people that support this policy already think farmers are doing relatively well, which was interesting to us. Okay, and then this is another graph that shows predicted support for supply management. Individuals that think farm income household was above average, support's a little bit lower, about 55% on average. Respondents who think farm households are poor, which is on average, so certainly there are some, but on average is not the case, are more supportive of the policy, right? So there's this interesting thing that individuals who are more supportive of the policy typically think farmers are less well off, which suggests to us that they view supply management as a redistributional policy to low-income farmers, which kind of makes sense if that's what you believe. Okay, so I've got a lot of these pictures. I'll maybe stop with the descriptive analysis so I can get to the actual empirical results. I've got lots of these figures that we're trying to decide which ones to put in the final paper, but there's lots of interesting data. Sorry, is there a question? I can pause for a moment here.
Please, anybody, if somebody have questions, please.
Please mute yourself, please.
Please, Navisa, mute yourself.
We've got some children in the room. I know what that's like. I've had kids run into my seminars and teaching many times over the last year as I'm teaching at home. So. Okay, so I'll carry on.
Abdul, एक मिनट यार
अभी सीट की कुकिंग कराऊंगा मैं
Okay, so I'll soldier on here. Can you still hear me okay? Okay, I hope so. So what I'm going to show you now are the actual regression results. So what I showed you up to this point were just sort of descriptive, non-causal estimates. But these are actually causal estimates, or we argue they're causal because it's from randomization, from a regression, a linear probability model of our full sample all our control variables with the randomized treatments in there. Okay, so again, the left-hand side variable in this regression is our outcome, support or not support the policy based on what you've learned. And so what we find is in the control group, so the group that just got that predicted support for the policy was about 68%. So that's relatively high. So it's broadly speaking a fairly popular policy in Canada. About 2/3 of people voted to keep the policy, and that's just in the control group. Okay, and these are just the confidence intervals around that point estimate. Okay, then we have the first treatment arm. So the first treatment arm are the group of people, those 1,200 people that received the cost information. Okay, so they got that personalized predicted value for what they would save if the policy were to be removed. Okay, so you can see that support on average comes down when they receive that cost information treatment to about 63%. So, you know, it's in the expected direction, it's statistically significant, it's different from our control group, but it's not very large, right? We're talking about maybe a 5 percentage point decrease in support for the policy, which is not large relative to average support. Okay, but it's, you know, it's there. It's a significant effect. Then we look at the treatment arm that receives the distributional information, right? So just the group that gets that, you know, it's basically a regressive policy in that it affects low-income people more than high-income people. Okay, so that pushes support down by about 7 and a bit percentage points. So again, support is falling significantly for that group, but it's still high. Even among that group, it's, you know, above 60% predicted level of support. So still quite high. And then we've got that combined information group that get both pieces of information, and that pushes support down by, you know, 6.5 percentage points approximately. So, you know, the takeaway from this, that, you know, again, we argue that these are causal effects because this is a randomized controlled trial. We think we've got fairly balanced treatment arms. So, you know, we're pretty confident that these are well identified causal effects of our information treatments. So what do we draw from, you know, these average effects? The average treatment effects, these ATEs, are pretty small, actually, relative to what is observed to be fairly high support for the policy. You know, 68%, something like that. Now, this is interesting to us because when we looked at the descriptive data that I showed you before, there is pretty significant heterogeneity among people in who supports the policy and who doesn't. Right. So, for example, people who support free trade are much less supportive of the policy. But what we're finding is that once you've determined whether or not you support supply management, based on your underlying preferences for things like free trade and local food, these big picture issues, you're not really responsive to information specific about this policy itself. Right. You might be very progressive in how you feel about taxing the rich and giving to the poor, but then I can tell you, well, this is actually a regressive policy that's harder on poor people. It doesn't move you very much on average, which is interesting to us, right? So that's where this phrase baked in comes from, is that, you know, what we're observing is that people's underlying strongly held preferences for things like redistribution really determine their support for specific policies, even when we tell them something specific about this policy that runs contrary to their, you know, their broadly held opinions, which was quite interesting to us. Okay, so you know, I see I'm getting near the end of my time, so I'm just going to go quickly through some. We've got lots of these heterogeneous treatment effect investigations that we're still working on. I'll quickly go through some of the more interesting ones. One of the more interesting ones is we were interested in if people misperceive the effect of the policy, are they more responsive to information, new and better information about the policy? So we've got a number of ways we can do this, but the most relevant one and the most interesting one to us was that if you recall in the survey, we specifically asked people, here's what supply management is, and then before they got treated, we say, what do you think this policy does to food prices? If we got rid of the policy, do you think prices would go up, down, or not change? Okay, and so we know what they view. before we ask a referendum question and before we treat them. And so what we argue is that people who say that prices either would not change or say that prices would go up without supply management are misperceiving the policy. They're kind of wrong, right? Because most people agree that if this policy were gone, prices would go down. Okay, so what we're interested in is, are people that got this question sort of wrong, that misperceive the directional effects on price, were they more or less responsive to that cost information treatment? So that's what this picture shows us. So these are people who said that if you get rid of supply management, prices will rise, which, you know, most people would say is not the case. If you get rid of tariffs, prices typically go down. Okay. So what we find is the control group of people who were wrong on prices had support very high, almost 90%. Okay. And then the people who got then of that people who were wrong that then got the cost treatment, that actually affected them. It pushed their support down by almost 20 percentage points. Right. So what we do, the way we describe this is correcting that misperception made a big difference. Right. So people who were wrong about the price effects internalized the information we were giving them, and it affected their view on the policy. Okay, this middle group are people who thought prices wouldn't change. Okay. Also, either they're unsure, so they say, I don't know, or they think it won't change, in which case they're probably misperceiving the effects as well. And we're seeing an actually even bigger effect. So the control group, who didn't get the cost treatment, had support of about 82% on average. Then we treat them with the cost information. Actually, this is costing you a lot of money. They internalize that information. Predicted support goes down by about 20 percentage points. So another very big effect. Okay. So, and then these are people who sort of already knew what this policy was doing to prices. And you can see there's not much difference, right? So, you know, the way we interpret this is people who either aren't sure about the effect on prices or are straight up wrong, internalize the new information and it affects them. Okay. So again, on average, the treatment effect wasn't big, but within all of these, you know, this is thousands of people. Within that, we observed that people who are taking on new information that was they misperceived prior are getting affected. Okay, so this was quite interesting to us. You know, I'll maybe skip through this. There's one other heterogeneous effect that I wanted to talk about. So if you recall back to our customized cost treatment information, within that group who got the cost treatment information, there's a random element, and that random element was how big the price premium is from the policy. Because we don't know exactly how large the price premium is. You know, it changes over time and space, and it's controversial. So what we did is within those 1,200 people that got cost treatment, we randomized how big the price premium is. And what we were interested in was within that arm, those 1,200 people, were people who got a 50% price premium more responsive to people that got a 10% price premium, which you would think would be the case, right? So this is just sort of a crude illustration of our extensive margin effect. So support among the control group was about 67%. Support among the group that got the cost treatment was about 62%, right? So there's a difference. Now, this is what I'm trying to visualize here is within that group of 1,200 people, are people who got like a 50% price premium in their treatment less supportive than people who got a 10% price premium, right? You know, people might think, okay, this policy cost me a little bit more money, I can live with it. But people who are told, well, it's increasing my grocery budget on these products by 50%, okay, I'm not okay with that big a price premium, right? So what we were wondering is, well, within that 1,200, are we going to observe sort of a downward sloping function here between the size of the premium and predicted support for the policy? So this isn't what we actually estimated, but this is sort of what we were investigating. Would we see something like this within these randomized price premiums? And so what we found, these are our actual results from our model, is no, we didn't, which was surprising and interesting to us. So within the 1,200 people who got the cost treatment, this is sort of what we describe as an intensive margin effect. If you were treated with cost information, did it matter how big that treated cost premium is? And basically, no. So we're finding, these are our standard errors or our confidence intervals around these point estimates, and they all overlap, right? It's not, they don't trace out a downward sloping line, and they all overlap. We can't really distinguish between them. So interestingly, we're finding that within that group, it doesn't matter how big the estimated premium is that we treat you with. You either support it or you don't. You respond to getting cost information, but not within that range. So, this was interesting to us. We spent a lot of time looking into and trying to understand this. Turns out this is not an unusual result. Similar studies have looked at this effect in things like a carbon tax, or not a carbon tax, sorry, electricity pricing. So if people get treated with subsidies for electricity prices or premiums, they respond to getting that treatment effect, but not within the size of it. So there is some literature on this, and that I won't spend much time going into, but this result was quite interesting to us. That, yeah, you respond to the cost treatment on average, but within that 10 to 50%, not really. Surprising and interesting. So, I've got lots of other results. I'll maybe leave most of them and just discuss sort of the takeaways from our research. What we find is that support for this policy on average is quite high, but it varies within different groups of people across these dimensions that we measure in our survey. So, voters of the right of center political party in Canada are less supportive, right? And people in certain provinces are more or less supportive, for example. So there is heterogeneity within Canadian voters on whether or not they support the policy. But on average, it's pretty high. But once you've sort of determined your support for this policy based on, do you support freer trade or do you support redistribution to low-income people? Responses to the information treatments that we provide are not very large on average. These ATEs, these average treatment effects, were actually pretty small, less than 10 percentage points in almost every case. Okay, so that's where we get this phrase baked in. We're arguing that preferences for policies like this is just one policy, right? But we view it as fairly representative. Preferences for specific policies like this are baked in. Right, so people have strongly held, deep-seated opinions on things like redistribution and free trade and subsidizing farmers and safe food and all this stuff. And these come together to form their strongly held opinions on specific policies. And even if we tell them that this one specific policy may run afoul of your opinions on redistribution, you're not that responsive. Okay, these are baked-in preferences. There is some heterogeneity in that, though, and some of it is interesting and makes sense, right? If you misperceive the price effects of supply management, you're more responsive to being to having that misperception corrected. Okay, there's some other things that I haven't had time to go into, but in the paper we've got lots of this. We're doing actually this afternoon. We're actually meeting to talk about this. We're looking at some other ways to investigate heterogeneity. We're looking at some machine learning techniques to some of you may have seen this causal forest stuff that Susan Athey's doing. So we're trying to apply some of those sort of more cutting edge techniques to our heterogeneity. And then I've got some grad students working on some other issues that were in our survey question that I haven't gone into, that I haven't had time. I don't think I'll have time. Looks like I'm at about an hour here, but we've got a few other little experiments within our survey that we don't actually have results on yet. But we're looking at things related to how voters feel about compensating farmers. If the policy were to be removed, how do you feel about compensating farmers for the lost value of their quota? Things like that. So, with that, there's some of the stuff that I won't get into. But, with that, I think I'll wrap it up. And if people have questions or discussion, we can leave some time for that. So I'll leave it there, and I can hang around for questions. So thanks for your time.
Yes, thank you. Can I have a comment, Professor Rank Cardwell? Yeah. Can I have a discussion, please?
Please, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Cardwell, for giving us a very, knowledgeable, presentation. It's really, sensitize us, have to do same type of, study in case of Pakistan as well. But, as being a student of economics, we had been taught that, markets basically, they give the signals for resource allocation. And if you have a proper supply management policy, then basically that distorts the market signals. So it means that markets, they are not being allowed to work properly. So how you think about that?
Well, certainly this is not a competitive market, right? I think I described a little bit, especially in my undergraduate courses, I spend a lot of time teaching my students, in our first year econ, we see a competitive supply and demand market. This is very different, in which the market signals absolutely are not happening as we would expect them to, right? So production is capped at the national level. So farmers are not responding to price signals, even domestically or internationally. And, there's all sorts of interesting unintended consequences of this policy through the restrictions, through the trade restrictions and through the prices. So, that's why this policy is so controversial. It is so unlike most of the other agricultural and food markets in Canada, in that it does exactly what you've described. It is very distorting on prices and on incomes and on trade flows. So, our purpose in this paper was not to advocate, as researchers, we're not advocating for or against the policy here. What we were trying to do is given these huge distortions that it does create, and some of the consequences of those distortions, what do lay people who are not economists, and not even necessarily economic students, engineers and doctors and construction workers and a wide sample, how do they feel about the policy given what they know about it? But yeah, absolutely, it is what we would describe as a highly distortive, under WTO language, a coupled trade distorting policy. And I participate quite extensively in activities of, for example, the International Association of Ag Economists, and I've had discussions with researchers from a lot of countries. I can remember at our last meeting in Vancouver with some researchers from, I think they were from Nigeria, and who were quite curious about, they were being asked by their employers at the government looking into a policy like this. And what I emphasize to them is, really make sure you understand all of these very important unintended consequences, in terms of capitalized value in the quotas and higher consumer prices, particularly in a country where incomes are low, right? In a country like Canada, where the budget expenditure on food is relatively low, an average Canadian household spends 12, 13% of their income on food, right? That varies depending on household, but on average, it's quite low. The Engel coefficient in a country like Canada is quite low. But in other countries where incomes are much lower, the Engel coefficients are much higher. So a policy that increases food prices should be much more controversial and should be thought about much more carefully.
Yes, just have one more comment that, you have nearly 4,500, I think, sample size. And how in that sample size there are consumers as well, and there are farmers as well. So can you please tell us, what was the percentage of the farmers in that, in that sample size? Yeah,
so great question, and you're right. So our survey is 5,400, and within our survey we had two questions. One is basically, did someone in your household derive most of their income from farming? So we kind of knew if the respondent was from a farm family. So we did know that. We also specifically asked, of those households, are any of you in supply management? So are you a dairy farmer, or is someone in your household a dairy farmer? And the short answer is, that, the share of Canadians who are actively involved in farming is tiny, right? So I can't remember the number of farm households we had, but it was so small that we could observe differences in support for the policy, but there were so few of them. Like, you know, so for example, in Canada, approximately 1% of Canadian households are involved in farming. So it's very small. And of those households, a tiny share of that are in supply management. So we couldn't do anything meaningful statistically with that because the sample was so small. You know, the confidence intervals are enormous. But it was a handful, literally a handful of respondents who were in farming. So among that small handful, we did observe stronger support for the policy, especially for the supply management farmers. But I think it was fewer than 10 respondents. I might have been 5 or 6 that were actually supply management producers. But it wasn't enough households to get like a statistically significant estimate, because there just aren't enough. I mean, Canada's a large agricultural producer and exporter, but the number of people is actually very small. The farms here are so large and heavily capitalized that there's just not a lot of people, relatively speaking, involved in producing. So we did know that, and we did observe stronger support, but we couldn't really do anything interesting statistically because it just wasn't enough people, not enough observations.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, and please accept my apologies as there was some electricity issue here at UF. I'm not sure what happened today, but it normally doesn't happen here. But it is technology. Sometimes it happens. And thank you very much, Dr. Khalid, to moderate during time 10-15.
No, I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks. Looks like a big group, so I'm happy to have an audience. Thank you.
Yeah,
you know,
yes, we have
a few more hands here. I'm happy to take those questions if people have.
Yes, Binish Sarwar Khan. Binish, please unmute yourself.
Okay, sir. I have joined. I think around 7:30. But I have a question because, as you know, Dr. Khalid, that we are going to brought up a project of PKNC. So that's why my question for our speaker is, what are the ways of communicating policies to the farmers? And what type of ways or communication ways which are more effective to communicate every policies and everything which is happening in the government and management is transferring to the farmers? And second thing, although I think so, the answer will be yes from speaker, but all the farmers, are they skilled or are they educated for that farming? For that purpose, because I just want to relate it with Pakistan, the situation in Pakistan, because in Pakistan, a lot of farmers actually don't know what are the policies are going on in the government, and here in Pakistan, farmers even usually don't go in supply management. They usually use in between persons who do the supply management. Farmers doesn't even know what are the profits and what actually policies are going on. So what actually happening in Canada, I just want to know what are the ways you are people using to transfer these knowledge to your farmers?
Sure. Okay. Well, so to your first question about transferring information to farmers, certainly that is something that, my dean at my university and the university more broadly really encourages us to do. We call it extension work. And to be honest, I personally, the types of research I don't do as much of that, because I sort of do more of the work that I've described here. And I try and get my my research results more to policymakers and to government. So, I go and present at the federal government offices and describe to them, these are the effects of your policies, of trade policies, on consumers and on producers. Producers, especially in this industry and supply management, are very well informed about how the policy works. They know the ins and outs of buying and selling quota and their delivery restrictions and requirements very well. It is very much in their interest to know these policies, and there's not there's not a lot of them. I mean, there are maybe 11,000 dairy farmers in Canada, and they're very well organized. They have an extremely well organized, well-oiled lobby group, the Dairy Farmers of Canada, that does a lot of extension work. So they are very well informed. They know the ins and outs of this policy. And it's very much in their interest to know this because they are buying and selling these production quotas. And so they have to feel confident that this system of trade restrictions will keep the prices up to a level sufficient that they are willing to buy the quota. So they are actually very well informed. So to your question about informing farmers about this policy, they don't need me to do that. They know it very well. And they know the nuts and bolts better than I would. But what I do with my extension work is I more present work on the economic effects of this policy, broadly speaking, to government groups, to the producer groups. So, the Dairy Farmers of Canada might be interested in this. But the actual farmers really understand this very well already. They don't need someone like me. In some of my other research, I do go to producer group meetings. For example, Canada has been recently involved in a trade dispute about canola exports to China. So for a policy like that, the farmers, like the actual canola farmers, are interested. Is this going to end soon? Is it going to go on and on? And so for policies like that, where there's a little more uncertainty, I do go and speak to farmer representative groups. They'll put on an event at a conference center, and I'll give them, I wouldn't give them an academic talk like I've given you, but I will talk, this is how the World Trade Organization works. This trade barrier is probably not going to go anywhere, so settle in and get used to it. But we do have, in my faculty, we have natural scientists, soil scientists and plant scientists and animal scientists who do a lot more of what you're describing. So they will write extension reports and do webinars like this for farmers, where they say, space your crops up more, things like that, agronomic or nutritional, animal nutrition work that I don't really do. Most of my work is sort of intended for policymakers. So I hope that's helpful.
Yes, I hope that is helpful. Thank you, Professor Khan. Just to add in, we are already into a very extensive wheat campaign. All over 20,000 students of university are already engaged in this campaign, and they are in the field. And I will also be traveling tomorrow, early morning, to the farmers' fields for concluding, to attend a concluding session of the wheat campaign. So it is always a good thing that agricultural scientists, they should meet with the end stakeholder, which is the farmer. Dr. Binish was talking about, specifically was asking about the policy, as we have this initiative here about food security. Being part of that project, that is Pakistan, Korea, and food community nutrition. And that is, there is a part in which I'm and together. That is basically policy, advocacy, and outreach. So we have to revise the policy, and we have to outreach activities as well, reach out to the rural communities, even the schools within rural areas as well as in cities. So it is something, so she was definitely asking from that perspective. So do we have any other questions? Do we have Professor Dr. Surfraz Hassan with us? Yes, sir, please.
Professor, thank you very much for giving a very comprehensive lectures that how policies affect the general public, producers and consumers. And now it is time in Pakistan when we are forced to evaluate how agricultural policies, they too affect the general public, they affect the producer, and how they affect the export of our country. Definitely we will get benefit from this presentation, as well as we will share our future research with Professor with you so that we can better evaluate the policies which are in Pakistan. Thank you very much for delivering such a comprehensive lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, maybe I'll just add, just in response to that point, is I know it wasn't really a question, but you raised a few things that are interesting and relevant to a lot of my research, and that is, you know, when there's a change in an agricultural policy or trade agreement in Canada, I'm often contacted by either producer groups or the media, newspapers and TV news, and the question that they always ask me is, what will the effects of this change be on producers, on farmers? And what I always, you know, I try and answer to the best of my ability, but something I always push back a little bit on when they ask these questions is, you know, those are good questions and important, and we should ask them. But what is almost always ignored by these types of questions in the press is, what are the effects on everybody else? You know, so of course we're interested on the effects on producers, but especially in a country like Canada, there are really very, very few farmers relative to the rest of the country. And it's, of course, it's a very different story in more rural countries, right? But what I always push back on, and a lot of what my research has done is, well, what about beyond the farm? What are the effects of, in this case, supply management on consumers? You know, so there are only maybe 11,000 dairy farms in Canada in a country of 30 some odd million people. So it's a really small group of people, you know, a very small concentrated group of vested interests who benefit, but really what are the broader implications for everybody else? And so I really try and push back on to policymakers and to the media to talk about and think about and consider what are the effects on other people as well.
Thank you very much, Professor Ryan, once again. And thank you very much, Professor Dr. Sathis and Dean, Faculty of Social Sciences, for participating in the Dr. Beanish, do you have any other comment or question?
Sir, I do have one more question. I don't know, maybe our speaker is involved in it or not. Question is, do all the stakeholders like farmers actually involved in making policies for them, or they are made by the government and applied on them?
That's a great question. So of course, you know, the policies in this case are set through federal government legislation and trade barriers. So it is federal government jurisdiction. So for example, if Canada were to sign a new trade agreement that reduced the tariff rate quotas on imported eggs, that is federal government jurisdiction. So, you know, the cabinet of the current government would make a decision on that, and it would get voted through Parliament. So, you know, technically, these are government decisions. Practically, of course, the producer groups have a very strong voice in influencing how these policies are set. So supply management, you know, if I had another week that I could do a whole week just talking about the politics of this particular supply management policy. It is an incredibly controversial, interesting policy in Canada because the way that politicians decide to support or not support it have been very heated in recent years in Canada. So as it is now, every party that has a seat in Parliament publicly supports the policy because they've made this, you know, cost-benefit decision that they will lose more votes than worth it if they oppose it. Even though we have, you know, sort of these market-oriented right-of-center parties with seats in Parliament who otherwise would not support a policy like this, right? Because it's very interventionist, and but the politics of it are so complicated, and some of it is regional. You know, there are a lot of dairy farmers in the French language-speaking province of Quebec, which always complicates political considerations in Canada. So, you know, technically, these are these are policies set at the federal government level, but they are strongly influenced by the political calculus of lobbying from producer groups and votes in specific ridings, right? Like a specific rural riding in Quebec, in the province of Quebec, can be very important to, say, the Conservative Party of Canada. And they don't want to upset voters in that group, so they might choose to support a policy, in this case maybe supply management, that normally you wouldn't think a party like that would support. So technically it's a federal government jurisdiction. Practically, those decisions are strongly influenced by a lot of different considerations.
Somewhat similar to our situation that the policy is being implemented by the federal or provincial government, obviously influenced by some of the pressure groups as well. So, Sir Sarfraz, would you like to add something?
Yes, I would like to add something. Okay, basically, the situations is very different from in Pakistan from Canada. In Canada, you have very few large farms, whereas in Pakistan, we have a very small farm size, and there are large number of over, say, 10 million farmers in Pakistan. So their education level is too very low. Whatever the policy that is given by the government, keeping in view the circumstances. Say, for example, there is a shortage of wheat somehow, so government announced the support price is much higher than the previous year. So this is the policy, say, incentive to the producer. Now it is our duty, again being economist, how this price increase basically affect the consumer and how it will affect the producer. Both consumer and producers, they are, say, not very knowledgeable, they are illiterate, their education level is not as high as you have mentioned in your survey, that the people were informed. One was a control group, other was have some information, other some more information. On the basis of that information generated in your study. But such type of information is very difficult to generate in Pakistan. So keeping in view these limitations, definitely we will try to evaluate how the policies affect, say, the general public, producer and consumer, and to exporter or importer as a whole in the country. Definitely we will benefit from your experience, from your study, and from your help to, say, design better policy in Pakistan in the future. Thank you very much, Professor.
Great, thanks for the comment. I'll just respond to that by saying, our results, I think, apply broadly to all kinds of economic policies, in that people form opinions on government policies based on their underlying beliefs on things like trade and redistribution. This specific policy, we're looking at a very specific policy as an application. And in this case, it's a food policy in Canada that raises the prices of some food by some amount, right? And as you've described, that would be a very different situation in a country like Pakistan for a lot of reasons, right? Because on the one hand, there's a lot of farmers, a lot more than we have in Canada. In Canada, it's a very small group of people that benefit from this policy, at least benefit monetarily. And incomes are much lower on average in Pakistan. So people's Engel coefficients, they're spending a lot more of their incomes on food than the average Canadian, right? So in understanding our results, it's important to consider that an average Canadian household is spending, maybe 10, 12, 13% of their incomes on food. So if I tell them, this policy increases that a tiny bit, that may not push them to either change their decision on supporting this policy. But if you were to tell a household that spends 80% of their incomes on food, that the government has this policy that increases food prices even more, you might see a much bigger response, right? And we've looked at that a little bit in the context of our study. Are low-income households more responsive? And in our case, not really. But even among low-income households in Canada, that Engel coefficient is still pretty low. But in a very low-income rural setting, for example, where the majority of income is spent on food, they might be much more responsive to these treatments of learning that the government is actually imposing a policy that makes those food costs even higher. So, I think that the general story from our study are pretty relevant to a lot of policies. But for this specific policy, you know, the levels of support would be very different in a different country, I expect, for reasons like that.
Definitely. You are rightly said that in Pakistan, even poor people spend 80% of their income to food expenditure.
Right.
So,
Yes, we can have a couple of more questions. We have Hafsa, Batul, if you want to ask, please be specific.
Thanks for your presentation, sir. It was quite informative. I just want to know that in the recent COVID scenario, are there any possible effects on supply chain and management in Canada? And are there any specific policies to deal with these issues that are happening due to COVID in food supply chain? Thank you.
Okay, so, well, interesting. I actually, at the sort of near the beginning of the pandemic and about 4 months ago, the Canadian Journal of Ag Econ published 2 special issues on sort of exactly what you're asking. Right at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of concern about how the pandemic would affect the food systems in Canada. So production and trade and income and prices. So about 15 of us wrote articles sort of specifically addressing that question, looking at different markets. So, you know, the corn market and the wheat market and the dairy market and trade barriers. And so at the beginning of the pandemic, there were a lot of calls in the press saying things are going to be horrible and we're going to run out of food and the grocery store shelves will be empty. And the response from a lot of us academics was, well, hold on here. You know, we knew a lot about the supply chain for dairy in this case and other products. And we were actually a lot more confident that the system could handle what we expected to see at the beginning of the pandemic. So we sort of wrote this up, and if anyone's interested, it's open access. You can find it on our journal website. And then we followed this over the past 18 months, and what did happen to prices and production and farm incomes. And of course, there were disruptions. You know, probably the most important disruptions were that restaurants and food service outlets just closed across Canada, right? Which really changed things for wholesalers, processors, and distributors because they weren't selling into the locations that they traditionally were. So there was this transition for quite a long time where almost all of food consumption was being purchased in grocery stores instead of in restaurants. So the share of food budget being spent on food away from home went way down. So that really changed things for sort of the middle of the supply chain, the processing and distribution and retailing as well. And then, of course, you know, the restaurants just basically closed until things have started to open up a little bit more now. At the farm level, things really did not change as much as people thought. There were a lot of people, several people at least, that thought, well, this is going to be horrible for farmers. We need to increase subsidies to farmers. And we were saying, well, hold on a minute. That's really not what we're expecting to happen for a number of reasons. You know, crops were good. Trade borders stayed open, right? Our export markets stayed relatively available. And looking back now on that first year during the pandemic, we now have data and we can observe farm income in Canada on average actually was at a record high during the pandemic. So farm income held up very well. Trade flows kept moving. The borders stayed open. There was certainly concern that, you know, the U.S. is our big trading partner, of course. Borders for food really did stay open, both directions, imports and exports. And prices stayed fairly stable. You know, if we look at food CPIs over the last 18 months, they were actually quite stable. So specific to supply management, you know, dairy and eggs, there were some issues related to, you know, it's a perishable product. And so there were some issues with spoilage and wastage early on. Eggs and milk that would typically have gone to restaurants and food service outlets just weren't going there anymore. And we couldn't store it. So some of that did go to waste in the short run. But a lot of those obstacles were overcome quite quickly. And, you know, the big takeaway is that at least in Canada, the food system held up fairly well. And we've written about that if anyone's interested to look at it's the Canadian Journal of Agricultural Economics, and we have 2 special issues that really address your question sort of industry by industry, market by market. and look at what we thought might happen, and then a year later, what did actually happen.
Good night, sir. Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
I want to ask you some question. First question is, religion is affected on economic policies.
Sorry, could you please repeat your question?
I want to say you, religion is affected on economic policies and economic survey.
Region, you want to say?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Yeah. So he is asking about the regional impact on policies.
Region. Okay. So yeah, in the case of what we were looking at, that's actually very important. So I think I mentioned there are approximately 11,000, in this case, dairy farmers in Canada. So quite a small number, but they are relatively heavily concentrated in rural Quebec, the province of Quebec, the French language speaking province in Canada. And that has had very important implications for the existence of this policy for so long. So Quebec is a very politically sensitive region in Canada for a number of reasons. It uses French as its primary language, and it has a different history in the colonization and history of Canada. So it is a particularly sensitive area for politicians in trying to win votes. In a place like so Canada is a fairly urban country by international standards. Most people live in cities. They are farmers. So the effects of this policy, on the one hand, the benefits are primarily rural, right, to the producers of these products in rural areas, and there are not a lot of them. The costs are borne more heavily in urban areas where there are consumers. And then there is a distribution, of course, of a relatively high concentration of these producers in Quebec. So that has absolutely been important in the history, in this case, of supply management. That I'm actually not sure what the number is, but it's a disproportionately high share of these production quotas for particularly milk, but also turkey, eggs, and chicken, are in rural Quebec ridings where MPs are trying to win votes, right? So they are very aware of this calculation of this concentration of producers in rural Quebec when they are setting their opinions on things like supply management. So it's a very important consideration for politicians. And then, of course, it is also important in understanding the distribution of effects, right? As I said, the costs are mostly borne, they're borne by everybody because everybody buys this stuff, but the burden is more heavily concentrated in urban areas where there are lots of people. Canada is a fairly urban country. Most people live in fairly large cities. Well, large by Canadian standards, not large by Pakistani standards.
Okay, I hope that.
Thank you, sir. I understand.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I have another question. Can I ask?
Yes, sure. Be specific, please.
Okay. I want to study in Canada. So what opportunity for me, Canadian University and Canadian government?
In university, I guess graduate school would be the option. And most departments. So I guess I can just speak to my department. We have a lot of foreign graduate students in my department, and our website has sort of all the information you would need to apply. Some requirements would include like writing the GRE exam, or depending on what department you're interested in. But typically, in my experience, the students' first exposure is they would do an undergraduate degree at home, and then perhaps come to Canada or the United States for a graduate degree in whatever discipline you're specializing in.
Okay. Ismail, if you can, Abdul Rahim Ali, if you can see me tomorrow, I can help you on Monday regarding scholarship opportunities and all other things. If you want to have some information, you can come to my office. I hope, Professor, if you allow, we can ask for more questions, or should we finish it now?
No, I'm happy to stay for a few more minutes. Sure.
Assalamu
Okay,
alaikum, sir.
if someone, please introduce yourself as well. Yes.
Sir, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam, Mutiullah.
Yes, sir, this is Matiullah Mahmoud from Gilead, Baltistan. Sir, I am new student of agriculture. Sir, it's my humble request, if you have any WhatsApp group that provide that consist and scholarship, if you provide the number of that group, it will be best for me, sir, because I have a lot of interest, sir, to study abroad country.
Matiullah, yeah,
Yes, sir.
Matiullah, please, you can come to my office on Monday. We can have discussion about it. But this is not the right forum at the moment to ask such questions. If you have any other question regarding today's,
sir, overall your discussion was very fruitful, sir. I am glad, sir.
Okay, thank you, Matiullah, for your comment.
You're welcome, sir.
It looks like there are no further questions. Dr. Binish still has her hand raised. If there is anything else you want to add. Okay, I think that is it. There are no more questions. Let me take the opportunity to thank Professor Dr. Ryan Cardwell for sparing his precious time. More than 1.5 hours, almost 2 hours he has spared for us today, and obviously he would have been spent a lot of time on preparing this. So it is a pleasure to have you, sir, here. And it is always a pleasure to get some very knowledgeable.
Sir, it's my last question, sir. When you are providing e-certificate, sir?
Mutiullah, please, they will be provided within next month. I'm sorry, Professor.
He's quite all right.
From another province. So he belongs to Gilgit-Baltistan, the bordering province to China, the upper part of the country. So I'm really sorry for that. Let me take the opportunity to thank all the participants who stayed, even despite the fact that it is weekend, and really thankful to the participants. We have more than around 150 participants in total, and we will be, I will confirm it as soon as I recording of the event. And once again, Professor Ryan, thank you very much. I would like to have further discussion with you on this topic, as we do have some political economic issues here on subsidies and subsidies on output as well as subsidies on input, like wheat support price at one hand side, and on the other hand side we have consumer subsidies in the form of food support. So we can have a very good discussion about it. Some time you have opportunity. Once again, sir, thank you very much for sparing your time and participating.
Great, thank you. Thanks to everybody for attending. I appreciate the opportunity, and we'll hopefully cross paths again.
Definitely. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.